All right, so there's this name stricken through because, as some of you who know Frank might have noticed, I'm not Frank. He could not make it because he managed to submit talks to 2 different conferences at the same time and get accepted at both. And, you know, well, that turned out to be a physical impossibility. So instead of him, I'll be talking and going through his slides largely. So whenever it goes wrong, blame him, and if it goes well, you know, or the other way, whatever floats your boat. All right, so my name is Jos Poortvliet. I'm Dutch, live in Berlin, have a wonderful dog and a wonderful wife. Been around open source and Linux for a long time. Mandriva, Mandrake back in the day. These days, very obscure Linux distro, I guess, from Europe. Also use Debian, Ubuntu, and, you know, well, the whole thing back then. Even was using Arch Linux while already working as OpenSUSE community manager. Tells you about how open the OpenSUSE community is, by the way. Go check out the booth. They're a really wonderful bunch here, really wonderful people, and really, yeah, supporting a lot of other open source communities here. I know many booths that over time had trouble staffing their team, then merged for a while with the OpenSUSE crew that gave them graciously a place at their booth or a group of booths, and some of these communities then grew out of it again and now have their own booth. I think the GNOME team, for example, for a while were here just because OpenSUSE kept them, you know, kept giving them a space, and now they have their own booth again, which is really cool. Also, well, worked at OwnCloud, and I'm co-founder and now work at Nextcloud, just like Frank, who's the CEO there. And well, as in our role at Nextcloud, we are effectively building a competitor to Microsoft 365. You know, this thing that does everything, you know, Office, document sharing, Teams is rolled into it as well these days. It's a complete collaboration platform, and that's what we have built, except ours is open source on-premise. And, well, as a competitor, we, of course, are occasionally bumping into the behavior of Microsoft when it comes to certain anti-competitive behaviors. And so that got me, or got us, to this subject and to this talk. If I have time left at the end, which is likely, because I don't have that crazy much time I think I need, I can talk a bit about Nextcloud. There will also be 2 community Nextcloud talks tomorrow, and a talk from me tomorrow more about privacy. So I didn't even know about the other 2 Nextcloud talks until like a week ago. So there's actually a fair bit of Nextcloud here. Plus we have a booth. So if you're curious about how you can move away from big tech and, you know, run your own server or find one at a local hosting company and keep your data under your control, then, you know, come by the booth, or I'll maybe talk a little bit about it at the end of this talk if there are no other questions about this stuff. So let's talk about our digital world today. Data is the new oil. I think that's extremely obvious, especially now with AI and all the data that is needed to train them. Having the data means you can train the AI. If you don't have the data, even if you have the software, even if the software is open source, you can't create the model that you need. And if you can't create the model, well, in the end, you got nothing. So it is very important to have control over this data. And the companies who are currently providing us with all these beautiful free services, they are very smart, and they are trying to gobble up as much of the data as possible, even if it costs them money to do it. I would like to remind you that something like YouTube is still losing money, technically. But the data will be worth it someday, I'm sure. And this also goes for all the photos hosted on a variety of services like, I don't know, Flickr, and obviously by Facebook. And more companies are slowly realizing they are software companies, and software has become more important. I think that new technology like ChatGPT makes it clear that if you're making a product in whatever sector you're in, and you're not looking at AI, you're doing it wrong, and you need to start paying attention. And again, for AI, you need data. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So this brings us to a subject that, at least in European political circles, is called digital sovereignty. And, well, what is it? It's the degree of control you have over the data you generate and you work with. So it's about control. It's about independence. And the term sovereignty, of course, is more relevant, I think, for a government than directly for an individual in this sense. So what's the problem with digital sovereignty? Why should you care? There are 4 kind of strategic risks with it. The first one is social. It's if you don't control your data, it's a problem for people, society, businesses in general. People change their behavior when they're being surveilled. There's been some interesting psychological experiments. If you put a camera on people, you tell them the camera is on, they'll behave different than if you tell them the camera is off. Even though, of course, whether the camera is on or off is not per se something they can see. People fundamentally act different when they're being observed. This is why having social media everywhere and having cameras around us all the time is changing the behavior of our kids. They don't behave the same way many of us did, when we grew up, because there weren't cameras around all the time. The whole TikTok generation, I suppose. I'm sure you're all familiar, especially if you're parents, you've been thinking about this, at least I would guess. And that there is a problem there. I mean, people need to control how they present themselves, and privacy is really important for that. You're a different person when you're with your family than you are at a conference like here, or than you are at your job. And to be able to control your different personality, who you are, and how your colleagues see you versus how your partner sees you, you need some degree of control over, your data, of your privacy. It's a very fundamental thing for people. It's very important. I mean, why do you wear makeup? Why do you wear certain clothes, a band t-shirt or a t-shirt of your favorite open source project here, or even deodorant? These are things that matter to us in a whole variety of ways. And, well, the deodorant is, of course, politeness, but there's more to it as well, right? You want to present a certain image of yourself. But it goes beyond that, and I think the political one is rather obvious. There's been plenty of talk about political interference using big data platforms, using Facebook and other platforms, and what this can do. There's currently a debate going on about TikTok and what it does. And I do want to point out that in China since 2018, there are very strict regulations on TikTok, who can use it, how long they can use it, and what they can use it for, while here in the US and in basically the rest of the world, there's only been the first traces of some kind of control over this from March 1st this year. So at least the country where the technology came from, they realized there are problems. There's an impact that these technologies have on society. And politically, of course, I mean, again, we don't know how these technologies really impact our political discourse, but that have an impact, I think, is obvious, right? Our communication happens online. It happens through platforms like Facebook, Twitter, etc. And these technologies are not public domain. They are owned by companies who can, within reasonable rules, do what they want, which is fair enough. Businesses can do what they want, and I think they should. But it is a problem that we're all on the same 4 platforms, because that gives them extraordinary power, and we don't know how they're using it. I mean, none of you can explain, and even the people at Twitter can't explain why a tweet shows up in your timeline when it's the recommended for you timeline. Facebook can't tell you why a certain thing shows up in that timeline. It's just, those algorithms are so complicated, they themselves don't really understand them, and not even talking about something like TikTok. And if they want to make a certain brand more popular, they can just tune somewhere in these algorithms something that makes positive things about the brand show up more often, and have negative things a little bit less often, and they start changing people's perceptions. Because after all, when you're on Facebook, you think what you're looking at is the opinions of the people you follow, your friends and family. But that's not true. There's a filter between what you're looking at and what's really, their opinions, right? There are multiple filters even. There's a filter that they choose what they share and what they put online. And they might have been triggered by things they saw, maybe made really pissed off by one message or another, real or not. And the second filter is, of course, what Facebook's algorithms or Twitter's algorithms, or you name it, have decided you should be looking at. So this has an impact, and we just don't really know what exactly. And of course, there's a business side to this as well, because if everything goes through a few companies, these companies have extraordinary powers. Ask any hotel owner if they have a choice whether they are on booking.com or not, and paying about 20–30% of the profits to that platform. They'll tell you they don't have a choice. We can say, well, it's free, business are free to do what they want, but it's not really a free choice. And how's cable internet going, right? What are monopolies doing in general to business? There's a risk here when it comes to data. And again, if data is new digital oil and it's all owned by a small number of companies, this is going to impact commerce. This is going to impact business as well. It's, yeah. If we let a couple of monopolies control the market, we all know what happens already. And last thing, but very much related to that, is of course innovation. If you build, and I've been giving this example since early 2000s. Back then, it was a much more relevant example than today, I think. But I always said, was talking about open office back then, LibreOffice, and trying to explain to people why it's important to have an open source office suite. And I said, look, if you invent a really amazing feature that makes writing letters incredibly much easier, think about something like ChatGPT, but then in early 2000s. That would have been a revolution. But you couldn't have built an office suite and then building your amazing feature. You were competing with Microsoft Office. You would not have been able to actually build a business around your feature unless you managed to somehow integrate it in Microsoft Office, which means you're entirely playing on their domain. In other words, the only shot you would have had at making money out of your innovation would have been, I don't know, get bought by Microsoft, probably for a nice discount, because what else could you do? It limits innovation. You couldn't really have built something. Sure, it's a free market, but only free as long as you're Microsoft, because if your product isn't 100% compatible with Microsoft Office and also seen as such by other people, then, good luck. And it is, of course, the same today with, well, lots of products. Right, so now I'm not saying all of this needs to be solved by government, but this talk is about what Europe is trying to do and how they're fighting with Microsoft about this, so that's where we'll end up either way. Let's have a look a little bit at what Europe is up to. Now, I'm first going to talk a little bit about privacy in general, because there has been a couple of regulations about this in Europe since 2000. And what they tried to regulate here was the control of individuals over their data. So can you put, if you hand over data, your personal data, maybe just name and password, but maybe also other data to a company, and this company was a US company or another company somewhere else, what happened to that data? Did you have any recourse if the data leaked, etc.? And, well, this regulation put in some rules, but basically what it said was US privacy rules and European privacy rules are equivalent. That was kind of what it boiled down to. And the thing is, they're not. Certainly not when it comes to the rights of foreigners. So when this finally ended up at the European Court of Justice, they gave a big no to this. They said, look, in Europe, privacy is a fundamental human right. And in the US, it is far less protected, as many of you might be aware. And so, well, this was considered invalid, this rule. Of course, it had already been in effect for quite a while. And the European government started working on a replacement, which they called the EU-US Privacy Shield, which had some different wordings, but in the end was pretty much the same. And as we'll see soon enough, would also be struck down by the courts. In the meantime, Europe was actually strengthening its privacy regulations with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. How many of you are familiar with the GDPR? Oh wow, that's like 2/3. Are you all law nerds? What what is the audience here?
We have to know it in order to be able to implement privacy in our own systems.
Fair enough.
California has CCPA and CCPA.
Right, California has CCPA and CPRA, yes. Yeah, and they're modeled after GDPR. Yeah. Sorry, I'm repeating now here, but it's pointed out to me that it's relevant if you, well, do legal related stuff in the US as well. Yeah, I knew that the Californian law was modeled after the GDPR. I don't know, of course, how close this modeling is, but if so many of you are familiar with it, then I'm not going to spend too much words on it. But it basically puts a whole bunch of limitations, of course, on what companies can do. They have to be transparent, they have to remove data if you ask for it. In other words, it really puts the user in charge of what happens to their data, at least to quite some degree. In Europe, it mostly applies to bigger companies or commercial entities. At least that's what it's intended to be. In practice, you see a lot of organizations be sometimes maybe more worried about it than is really necessary. On the other hand, I think a little bit of data and privacy hygiene is a good thing. So overall, I don't know, it causes more paperwork, but I think it is a good thing to be more aware of privacy, security, etc. Anyhow, this obviously raised the bar, and well, then this happened. So President Trump signed the Cloud Act, which in kind of simple terms says if data is under jurisdiction of a US company and a US judge says, I want it, they get it. Doesn't really matter where the data is. And that's rather incompatible with the GDPR that says the user whose data it is in control over the data and gets to decide who gets access to it, period. Of course, via a European judge, you could overrule this, but not a foreign judge. And in the end, the US is a foreign country. So when this ended up in front of the European Court of Justice, guess what? There was a big nope again. So this means the GDPR and the Cloud Act are incompatible, which technically should mean that as a US company, you can't hold data of European citizens, period. Of course, if that were the case, there would be a huge number of companies in violation with European law. And honestly, I have not seen a real answer to that. This seems to be the current situation, although there are discussions about it. I believe, well, some of the laws, the Digital Market Act got through in Europe already. So they basically are, in a way, going to raise the bar in a couple of related areas as well. So Europe keeps moving into a more protection for privacy, security, etc. So Digital Market Act, it has a ton of provisions because they like to make the laws complicated. But one of the more relevant ones is that, in a way, you could call it a GDPR for business, in a way that it forces companies to also respect data ownership of businesses, and it puts especially strengthened limitations on really big companies on a couple of the things that I mentioned earlier about competition, pretty much. So forcing companies, for example, to give you the lowest price to be allowed on your platform, like Booking.com does, this can be challenged under the DMA. So you can say, yeah, but like if people come directly to my door, I don't need to give them the 30%, so I can give them a lower price. And if then Booking.com says in their rules, well, if you want to be on a platform, you're not allowed to do that, that's a rather anti-competitive move. And the Digital Markets Act might forbid that. I mean, it's all legal, so certainly is hard to find. Meanwhile, the US is moving in the other direction, now thinking about whether even encrypted data should be accessible by US law enforcement, which again continues to be going against what the GDPR and European laws would consider okay or legal. Now, a new solution, we had the safe harbor and the other one, already forgot the name, but we got a third one now, which is a transatlantic data privacy framework, which was agreed on in principle, and I think this was already now, this has already been fully agreed on and signed. They've added a dispute mechanism to basically the previous systems, but it is still, I believe, in front of a US judge and not a European one. So kind of waiting for a Schrems 3 decision by the European Court of Justice, which, I don't know, if you ask me and if you ask Schrems, who is an Austrian lawyer after whom these cases are named, if you ask them, it's probably going to be the same thing. It's going to be struck down, after which we will get probably another ruling or another, new deal. Given the direction of both countries, if you go back here, given the direction things are moving with the EU creating more strict privacy regulations, and the US giving more control to law enforcement, I'm quite curious to see how this will develop. We can debate this later, or even now if you want, because I have a different subject going forward that I want to talk about. Are there any questions about this, or maybe debate points or things to add? Because I'd be happy. Yeah, please ask. I will then just repeat the question. Yeah, so the question is, if I may rephrase it that way, if you look back at traditional operating systems like Windows, this is running in your home, on your premise, under your control. But with a mobile phone, I mean, let's be honest, the degree of control we have over the data on our phone is minimal at best, right? I mean, Android syncs almost everything by default, and so does iOS. Apple does a fair bit of effort in encrypting and end-to-end encrypting, and then saying like we don't have access to it. So I think once the data is in plain text on the servers of these companies, aka Google and Apple, they fall under these regulations, and therefore, yeah, everything that we're recording and taking with our mobile phones is a problem in these regulations, I think. When it's end-to-end encrypted and you don't have access to it, at least directly on the server, it gets a little more interesting, because in theory, you could, as Apple, you could of course push a specific update to a specific person's iPhone that bypasses the whole end-to-end encryption and just uploads the files. And I mean, that person none the wiser and nobody else. And I think it's an interesting legal question whether a judge could force Apple to do that. I guess that would be really quite a hard call. I would guess not. So end-to-end encryption, I think, protects you. I think this might also be why other players are also introducing more end-to-end encryption, because it creates this layer of trust. Of course, I could still do it, right? Like if WhatsApp has end-to-end encryption, I think this is mostly for legal reasons, because if you, in a unencrypted format, are trying to plot a terrorist plot and they don't catch you, there's blame. If it's end-to-end encrypted, oh, what can they do? So I think what they're looking for is ways to avoid having to, moderate conversations almost as much as they're actually trying to provide security. If you think of what happened in Myanmar, how many of you are familiar with what happened in Myanmar and Facebook? All right, that's not as many as I had kind of hoped. It's a bit of a nasty story, but in Myanmar, where, democracy is not as well established as over here, let me put it that way. Facebook did not employ many, if any, moderators, and so the conversations on Facebook there spiraled out of control, resulting in what has been recognized, I think, by the United Nations as a genocide on Rohingya Muslims living there. I think you will find most experts agree that if Facebook had proper moderation in place, this would not have happened. I think the implications of that are quite shocking, quite bizarre when you think about it. And then what happens if you employ end-to-end encryption and you can't moderate anymore? I mean, it'll save you money on moderators, might also result in more genocides. It's a weird world we're living in when you're wondering if end-to-end encryption is actually a good idea or not. I don't have any answers here either, but it's a bizarre conversation. Either way, I don't think I have any hard answers to your question. I think what you brought up, like the mobile phones and the way they send any data usually immediately to cloud servers, make the whole problem a lot more visible. All right, any more on this subject before I'm moving to antitrust? All right, because this gets us a little closer to what we have been up to at Nextcloud. I think many of you, because this was brought up in the beginning, many of you might be familiar with what happened with these two. For those who are not, the cliff notes of it, in the 90s, a company developed pretty much the first browser and built a business around it. Then Microsoft decided they wanted a piece of the pie, build a browser too, bundled it with Windows, which in the end killed, of course, the other company. And halfway down the killing of the other company said to antitrust authorities, this isn't really fair. We're not competing on a level ground here. You know, it's not about who has the best product. It's just about they have an operating system we don't, so they win. That's not really fair game. The antitrust authorities agreed a couple of years after Netscape went bankrupt, so that wasn't really helpful. But yeah, the bundling thing is still happening or happening again, which is where we come in. So as I mentioned earlier, Nextcloud is building a self-hosted, fully open source collaboration platform. So think of file sharing and syncing, think of Dropbox, Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive. Now what do you find bundled with Windows these days? OneDrive. So we went to the European antitrust authorities together with about 30 other small tech companies in the open source space, and we said, hey, that's not really a level playing ground here. Why can't we be in there as well? And well, this garnered a fair bit of attention and a whole bunch of conversations with the antitrust authorities. Let me be honest to you, we're not expecting them to fix this before, you know, well, I don't think we'll go bankrupt. We're doing just fine, but this is of course not going to get solved by them in a time frame that is relevant business-wise, but we do think that it's important that government is paying attention to this stuff. And we've been told with so many words that the Digital Market Act, for example, might help in this regard and might also then give the European authorities the legal tools to deal with it. I'm not sure if the Digital Markets Act is enough, and we would prefer if the cartel organizations would continue their investigation a little more aggressively than they are, but you know, at least there's talk happening, there's discussion happening. And other companies have also started conversations about this. For example, Slack has filed a complaint about the integration of Teams in Windows, which is of course again the exact same story. But luckily, Microsoft has responded by of course integrating their products even deeper. And it's funny because those of you who remember the browser wars in the 90s and the Internet Explorer versus Netscape story, they might remember what Microsoft did to deal with this. They integrated their file manager and the web browser in a single product, and then they said to the antitrust authorities, yeah, but it's so deeply integrated, how can we ship our product without a file manager? Sorry. It's quite amazing, and it seems like they're trying to do the very same thing right now with OneDrive, making it such an integral part of the product that if government might decide they need to disentangle the mess, they will just say, yeah, but we can't, because, you know, how could you? So yeah, it's they're up to their old tricks. I would say it's quite interesting to watch, and of course you see them in other places as well, moving. SharePoint. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's happening there, but it won't exist as an on-prem product much longer. They're moving you to the cloud, whether you like it or not. If you talk about digital sovereignty, that's not fun. So a lot of organizations are actually looking for alternatives. Well, we're one of them again at Nextcloud. And well, I think many of you might also be familiar with the whole discussion about whether you need an online Microsoft account to install Microsoft Windows. I discovered that if you Google recommends searches on this, and well, the other one is very hard to see, but let me see. If you want to stop Windows from saving to OneDrive, there were, what was it, 5.2 million results. So people are definitely wondering how to get rid of that integration. So again, customer demand, I don't know. People are not all a fan of it. So anyway, the saga is not over. I can't really predict what's going to happen here, only that it's probably going to take a long time. Well, I promised it wouldn't take that long. It did not. Any questions? Yes.
I'm old enough to remember the open document format.
Oh God.
It's been a break from Microsoft monopoly and a tremendous amount of energy. For lack of a better way to put it, Europe has a long-standing tradition of passing well-sounding laws and then
Failing to.
a viable alternative and finding a convenient way to ignore its own laws in order to keep getting an existing need.
So true.
So how real do you think this is?
Yeah. So let me repeat the question. Mr. here pointed to the open document format situation and said Europe has a proud tradition of creating very sane laws and then ignoring them. If I may be so bold as to summarize it like that, and you're asking how I see this develop, I'm not expecting a lot of changes. Let's be honest, I mentioned digital sovereignty in the beginning. Yeah, I mean, let's make it extremely concrete. I mean, if European court would say, you know, today you have to abide by the GDPR in the interpretation we used before, aka you can't put your data on the jurisdiction of a US company, then all of Europe's economy comes to a grinding halt because they're all completely dependent on either Google or Microsoft. And it's just a plain and simple fact. And if you say, it would be similar, I think, even here in the US, if you would say, let's take this privacy laws, the Californian privacy laws, 100% serious, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of stuff also stops working because, you know, you can't, these companies are built around violating privacy because, again, they need all the data and they need to be able to use it. I mean, ChatGPT, DALL-E, the new AI image generators, would they work without all the copyrighted image from artists all over the world? Yeah, they can't create art in the style of Friedrich Kahler if they don't have training data from the artist. And this is true, of course, for all of this. So I don't see it changing. I think Microsoft, before I get to your next question, one more thought on that, because I've noticed that Microsoft knows this, like they're very much aware of this pattern, and they're basically reinforcing it. So quite some years ago, when the term digital sovereignty started to become relevant, I think it's about 4 or 5 years ago, I went in Berlin to a Microsoft event about digital sovereignty, where they basically got on stage and told the gathered politicians there that, you know, Germany should stick to cars, leave the software to Microsoft, and you have no alternative, deal with it. I mean, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's pretty much what it boiled down to. Yeah, as long as European politicians believe that, well, they're not going to try to enforce the law, right? And so you create a nice self-fulfilling prophecy, which is, of course, well, that's a great way of dealing with it. Yeah, then your question. microphone. I think it's easier.
I've been hearing recently that some of the hybrid cloud providers are being forced to develop private clouds for individual companies to deal with, like GPDR and that sort of thing. I know IBM has been doing quite a bit of that. Has Amazon and Microsoft been developing country-specific clouds to deal with those issues?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So when we're talking about cloud, there's of course a whole bunch of different meanings to that. I'm fully aware of that. One of them is of course when you're talking about AWS kind of clouds where you run various workloads on, but also like the workloads themselves, aka an application or set of applications like Microsoft 365 is referred to as a cloud. So let me answer about both. I mean, when it comes to a cloud infrastructure like AWS, you have OpenStack these days, so you can run it internally. And there are plenty of companies doing that, just building their own internal cloud to run their own workloads on, sometimes doing hybrid stuff. I mean, you're all aware of this because there's tons of conversations about this happening. When it comes to Amazon offering kind of an internal version of AWS to companies, I'm not aware of that. I also would imagine that those companies would simply use OpenStack because there's a great degree of compatibility there. I mean, it doesn't maybe offer all the bells and whistles, but I think as a company, if you say, look, we can't use AWS, but we want the feature set, then, you know, with OpenStack and Kubernetes and all these things, you can get fairly close with perhaps some extra cost or maybe even not, right? There are ways to save costs with that as well. When it comes to Microsoft, it's interesting. I've had a conversation with a gentleman from a very big European car manufacturer. You know, and I asked, like, how do you deal with the GDPR issues? And they were like, well, we're rather paranoid about that. So yeah, our data cannot leave our premises. I was like, okay, so, you know, are you using Nextcloud? And he told me they had basically gotten such a kind of private cloud from Microsoft, something that was really completely firewalled off from the rest of Microsoft's cloud service. So from what I can tell, because this is not being, I haven't seen this offered anywhere. I don't think they offer this to anyone who just asks. But if the customer is big enough, they'd rather not lose the customer to a alternative solution like ours, I suppose, and they will offer it. I'm sure there are technical difficulties that come with it, and there are significant costs, I'm sure. They have tried to run a European hosted, owned, and controlled version of Microsoft 365 together with Deutsche Telekom, the German telecom company. This basically run on to technical issues. They did not, apparently, because I mean, you know, they announced there was no demand when they shut it down, but I mean, I find that hard to believe. But the rumors were that they just couldn't get it to work properly without breaking and causing various issues. But they are trying similar things again. So the trick they're doing here is they're basically just letting Deutsche Telekom, they create a new company that's then a European company, partially owned by Microsoft, partially owned by Deutsche Telekom. That company, of course, and pay license money to Microsoft, runs the software on German servers managed and controlled by Deutsche Telekom. Only Deutsche Telekom employees have access to it. Yeah, it's a kind of a legal solution to the problem that works. Because then if Microsoft would be ordered to hand over data, they can't. Deutsche Telekom owns and controls the data. Of course, Microsoft could do the same trick and change their software and, you know, hand over the data that way, but that then you come back into the legal quagmire of, can you force a company to hack one of their customers' phones effectively by providing a special payload that uploads data? I mean, I think that's really, I don't know, it might be happening, of course, because this might all be then happen sealed, but I think that's really tough on. So this is happening, and I don't know the degree of it because it's not that public. I hope it answers the question. Yes?
Quick question about Nextcloud. Sorry to
No, no.
change the subject a little bit, but I love the product, love everything it offers. The one thing that I think was a little concerning was that email hosting and delivery. That's one thing it seems your competitors do pretty well, and whether, again, it could be sort of a monopoly situation that so many people have Gmail and Yahoo accounts.
Right.
They deliver kind of internally. They don't need to mark as spam, but when we have a local, SMTP server that sends something out, it gets blocked, it gets filtered, what have you. What is Nextcloud, or what are European providers doing to maybe compete in that space?
Yeah, you open a whole new can of worms. Email. Once upon a time, completely federated and open, and I think it's still a good model. But yeah, given now everybody's hosting at Gmail, yeah, calling it open is not really the right term anymore, because if you get blocked by Gmail and Hotmail and maybe one or two more, then effectively you don't matter. Of course, you have companies like SendGrid that then pride themselves on having deliverability. We at Nextcloud are not currently offering a email server as part, so our product has a mail client, but as I say, it's a client, because running a mail server, technically it's not hard. You can get tons of solutions for that. It's very easy to run a mail server and get some of your emails delivered some of the time. It's nearly impossible to run a mail server that gets all of your email delivered all of the time, because the big companies are constantly changing the rules and playing with them, and as long as Microsoft can get its emails delivered to Google and vice versa, they don't really care about the small players. And of course, one of the reasons for that is spam. I sometimes think it's also an excuse. But yeah, running a mail server is really hard. I mean, you still get, with most of your providers, you get an SMTP server, and it's usually fairly reliable. Lots of big companies still run emails, so I think it's more the trend that worries me personally than the current state. It is a bit nasty, but if you have a part-time sysadmin who knows what they're doing, they'll be able to keep your emails arriving. We also run our own mail server at Nextcloud. Not for the bulk email, like the marketing emails. For that we use SendGrid or something similar, which is, I think, also, yeah, that's okay. But given the trend, I think 5 or 10 years from now, it might be nearly impossible. Honestly, I leave this problem to other people to fix, because it's a tough one.
Nextcloud's you're already doing a ton of things, so yeah.
Exactly.
To add email to that would be one
Yeah.
other thing. But
Yeah, there is a small company, trying to think of the name. They built a open source tool that monitors the deliverability. And what they were trying to do is to automatically configure a mail server to guarantee deliverability. So what they wanted to do is you have a bunch of mail servers that would have their app installed, open source app that runs on the mail server. And if mails don't get delivered, then you try to fix it. And then it would then roll out that fix to the whole network, kind of. So kind of like solve collaboratively and in a decentralized way this problem of big tech constantly coming up with new problems for the mail servers to solve. I can't think of the name. Come to me later. I'll try to find it. But it was a pretty clever solution and open source. So, any more questions? We have a few more minutes left. Yes.
Are you aware of any crossplay between the European privacy laws and any form of cyberbullying or the like in terms of regulation against that?
Cyberbullying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's part of the GDPR. I think this is separate legislation. I've not followed this closely, honestly, so I can't say anything smart about it, sorry. Any more questions? Well, we're close to the end, so... one more? A comment. Okay, well then I'll give you the microphone and that'll also be the end of it. So, thank you all. There you go.
Yeah, I had sort of a comment, what he said. Normally what happens between the EU and the US, or other countries that, or the EU in particular, they usually work with each other to adopt their standards. And normally the EU is usually a little more strict, so the US tends to adopt those over time.
Yeah, the same might happen here. Yeah, exactly. That's an interesting point. Yeah. I mean, I think the California privacy laws are a nice example of that already, right? All right, that's it. Thank you all. Appreciate the time you took.